This evening, Arizona legislators have resolved a $1.4 billion deficit in the state budget. What's new in the budget and what compromises had to be made? The U.S. and Ukraine strike a new deal that guarantees U.S. support for Ukraine for the next 10 years. Former CIA analyst tells us what this means for the war in Ukraine and how it will affect the 2024 presidential election. This is Before You Vote. Welcome, I'm Mike Broomhead. From executive orders to the Phoenix Police Department needing to reform, let's catch you up on some of the top news stories. First up, President Biden announces a new policy that will shield undocumented spouses of American citizens, potentially protecting over 500,000 immigrants from deportation. Now, many people think this is a political response to an executive order on asylum seekers and cracking down on people in this country seeking asylum and the number of people per day that can cross the border, effectively, as they say, closing down the border. Now, whether that is actually what's happening or not is debatable, but this seems to be a political response in many people's minds. But I also think that it's a precursor to something else. If you take a look at what we've been doing, we have been allowing people coming into this country with asylum claims and wait times of almost 5 years, sometimes more than that. Well, those people are going to put down roots while they're waiting. They'll put down roots in our community. They're going to develop relationships. They're going to get married, and we're going to have the same problem in the years to come. This is just something we think is going to happen in the future. Now, on the local front, the biggest headline in local news, the Department of Justice released a scathing report against the Phoenix Police Department. And this report took it over almost 3 years in the making, and it was about what the city expected, and it talked about training being bad, officers behaving badly, racist behavior. It really is a scathing report. But for rebuttal, we now go to the president of the Phoenix Law Enforcement Association, Daryl Kripling. Thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, thanks again, Mike. I appreciate you having me on.
I've seen the overview of the report. I haven't read a lot of the details like many of you have, but how do you respond to what you've read and what you've heard that the Department of Justice is saying about the Phoenix Police Department?
It's so egregious, to be honest, that it's almost unbelievable, because I've been a member of this department for 3 decades, and this is not the Phoenix Police Department that I know. This is not the department that I grew up in. This is atrocious, to be quite honest.
One of the things that I read in the overview when I was listening as they talked about is they actually said that that officers are trained to escalate situations. How do you respond to that?
I have never been taught to escalate any situation when I go to it. From the very beginning, it's use the appropriate force necessary, reasonable and necessary to affect whatever outcome you're looking to get, right? I mean, I have never been taught to increase or enhance any type of force.
We're
respond to a scene.
We're awaiting a city response to this. How important is it to have a police support in a city response to this? What do you need to hear? What do your officers need to hear from the city?
Well, I think every officer that's out there putting their life on the line for the community and serving the community that needs to hear the city is supportive of them and the job that they're doing and are willing to fight back against this just atrocious report.
We know that there has been, the city has said before this happened that they were going to push back against the consent decree. But after this report, do you think the city will acquiesce, or do you think they'll stay strong?
No, I think they're going to stay strong. And the reason I say that, this report is the worst that we've seen throughout the country, right? And I think it was intentionally done because our elected officials were not going to just give into a Department of Justice agreement in principle without reading what exactly they were uncovering. So I think that this was, intentionally more severe and more degrading to the police department and the city leaders themselves. So I think that this is only going to embolden them to still continue to stay strong and challenge what the Department of Justice has put in print.
Well, I'm a big advocate for what you do and the men and women of the Phoenix Police Department. I appreciate you being here with us and spending some time talking about it. I look forward to talking with you after the city gives an official response.
Sure. Anytime you want me to come back, I will have no problem doing that.
All right. That is Daryl Kripling from the Phoenix Police Department and the Phoenix Law Enforcement Association. Don't go anywhere. Senate President Warren Petersen talks about the new budget for Arizona, what was cut, and where the state's money will be going. We'll be back in exactly 60 seconds. Welcome back to Before You Vote. The Arizona legislature passed and the governor signed a budget that balances our budget, and it shaves $1.4 billion in spending. Joining us to talk about it, Senate President Warren Petersen. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Let's talk about the budget and some of the things that are in it, some that aren't. But coming to the conclusion to cut $1.4 billion, how did you get to that number? How were you able to get it that low?
Well, I feel really good about this budget. We cut government by 10%. I mean, if you could imagine Congress saying they cut government by, or federal spending by 10%, I think the population would be pretty happy. So I think Arizona should be pretty happy. We cut state spending by 10%, but yet we still protected K-12, transportation, and public transportation and public safety. But how we did it was there was no stone left unturned. We met with the governor for 3+ months. Near the end, we were meeting twice a day. So there's a lot of time and effort put into this, and just scouring all the line items and finding the savings.
Now, the Attorney General is not happy about the money that was taken from the funds from the opioid settlement, and actually told, I believe, one of the stations in town that she's not giving up that money and she may sue. How do you plan on resolving that?
Well, she'll lose. The settlement funds are to be appropriated by the legislature, which is exactly what we did. The settlement funds are supposed to be used for results of opioids, the negative consequences of opioids. Well, one of the biggest places we see that is in the prisons. And so that funding went to the prisons. That's the proper place to put the money. The money is meant to be spent there, and that's exactly what we did. So she may have, I could understand why she's upset, because she would love to spend the money herself on her own priorities. But it's really the legislature's call, and we spent it appropriately.
But if she says it's in my bank account, meaning the Attorney General's bank account, if she doesn't give up the funds, do you have the power to take it? I mean, does she have to give it up, or can you go and take it?
So I don't know that it's in her account. I actually think it's in an ADOA account.
Okay.
It is. If it is her account, then that's a different thing. But we have instructed ADOA in the as part of the budget. We instructed ADOA to disperse those funds. If she were somehow able to have access or control of the funds, then of course we would seek legal relief quickly, and I believe that would quickly be granted. So
one of the other areas of concern is the future of water, and there was supposed to be $1 billion from the previous administration for a set aside for the future of water in Arizona. Some of that money was swept away. There have been concerns about that money being put back. How do you address the water issue? Do you think it's a big concern, and how do we address it in the future if that money is swept away?
Yeah, so one of our top priorities this session has been water. We had a slew of water bills. It was very disappointing to see that one of the most important water bills we had got killed because an entity that wanted to sell water didn't want the competition. And so the governor was pressured by that and ended up vetoing the bill. But we did have a lot of water legislation. As far as the funding goes, yes, there had been over $1 billion. As we looked at the budget, worked with the governor, we have identified the water projects that we're looking at over the next couple of years. We're nowhere close to spending the $1 billion. We still have set aside over $450 million, but we did sweep some of that. And as those projects come online, then we will provide the funding that's needed for any water projects. But one of the really disappointing parts about this session was the governor, killing a lot of the water bills that made a lot of sense to pass. So
I appreciate the time, because I think people understand, they see the numbers, but they don't understand some of the details. I know you guys worked hard on this. I'm glad you're happy with the budget, and I appreciate the update.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Senate President Warren Petersen. We'll be back here in a moment on Before You Vote. Coming up, where do Arizona voters stand on the war in Ukraine? We take a look at the latest data in our Tracking Arizona segment. Then later in the show, former CIA analyst breaks down the security pact between the U.S. and Ukraine. This is Before. Welcome back back to Before You Vote. It's once again time for our Tracking Arizona segment. And joining us again is David Byler, the Chief of Research at Noble Predictive Insights. Welcome back again, David.
Thanks for having me.
Looking into something international, and it's voters' opinions on aid for Ukraine. I noticed something interesting. It's not a huge majority, but the majority of people polled believe that we are right in that sweet spot. Don't decrease, don't increase funding. What does this tell you?
Right. So I see a couple things in the top line data. First, there is virtually no support for Russia among the voters. Nobody wants to flip sides and support Russia instead. Second, what I do is I add up the people who say greatly increase, slightly increase, and do not increase funds sent to Ukraine, because we're already sending money to Ukraine. So that group is either saying to keep the money coming or add more. And that makes up a majority. There is a substantial minority here that says we should either slightly or decrease funds to Ukraine. There's a chunk that's unsure. But really, no matter how you slice this data, when you look at that top line overall statewide opinion, it is pro-Ukraine.
When you look inside political parties, most of the time you see stark contrast between the parties, but you're seeing some contrast within the Republican Party. Can you talk about that difference and what it means to you?
This was probably the most interesting finding in this question for this poll. It's that when you look at the Republicans, you see one faction. It's the Trump first faction. It's the conservative faction. It's the people who are really into sort of the MAGA branding of the Republican Party. They are the most likely to say we should decrease funds to Ukraine. Maybe not eliminate, not send money to Russia, but decrease, wind it down. You have a different group. You have moderate Republicans, Republicans who say they're more loyal to the party than they are to Trump. These are probably Republicans who came to the GOP from Bush or from McCain rather than from Trump and have stuck around. These people say, hey, keep the money coming or even dial it up. So within the Republican Party, there's these lines of divisions that you don't see on the left, where basically everyone is pro-Ukraine.
Which of the groups is the biggest inside that Republican Party?
Yeah, within the Republican Party, if you add up those three supportive groups, like I was talking about, amongst all Republicans, those supporters are still the biggest. But on net, it's only plus 10. There is a real chunk here that is, sort of isolationist, maybe not anti-Ukraine, but wanting less foreign intervention. And that is a very new development for the Republican Party.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic with the deficit spending in the U.S. I think this is going to be one of the things that plays a big role. As always, David, we appreciate the insight, not just the what, but the why. You always do a great job, so thanks for coming.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be back in a moment on Before You Vote. Coming up, how will the war in Ukraine affect future U.S. foreign policy and the 2024 presidential election? A former CIA analyst shares his thoughts. This is Before You Vote. Welcome back to Before You Vote. We've not covered international issues, but I do believe that foreign policy is going to play a big role in this election cycle. Joining us right now is George Beebe. He's the Director of Grand Strategy Program at Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and former Director of CIA's Russia Analysis. George, thanks again for doing this.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I want to start, obviously, the war between Russia and Ukraine. I want to get into some of the details with U.S. support. But where are we with U.S. support for this, and why is it important for U.S. sovereignty with a war so far away?
Well, right now, this war is not going Ukraine's way. Early in the war, the United States was able to provide the Ukrainians with high-precision weaponry, real-time intelligence that enabled the Ukrainians essentially to conduct a war of maneuver, to identify quickly where there are weak points on the Russian lines, exploit those, achieve some breakthroughs. But the Russians have transformed this war into a war of attrition. They've dug in defensively, and they're now intent on wearing the Ukrainians down, taking advantage of Russia's superior manpower, its larger military manufacturing base, and just over time exhaust both Ukraine and the West. And that's working. And the longer this war goes on, the more difficult the circumstances are for the Ukrainians. So the challenge that the United States faces is, how do you prevent Ukraine from moving slowly toward a collapse, and find a way out of this that preserves Ukrainian independence and sovereignty, recognizing that you're not going to be able to retake land that the Russians have right now. And that's something that the Biden administration is struggling with. They have managed to hold off a Ukrainian collapse for now, but they've not coupled this with any kind of a diplomatic strategy that has any prospect for ending this war on terms that are advantageous to Ukraine. So they're going to have to be rethinking some things.
When the accusation or the fear is that it's not going to stop in Ukraine, NATO is concerned about it. Obviously, Poland is very concerned. Is there a reality to that concern that Russia would not stop at this with Ukraine, that they would push further into parts of Europe?
I think there's very little likelihood that the Russians would push into NATO-held territory. They have shown a great deal of incapacity to advance very quickly against Ukraine. This is on territory that they know well, immediately on their borders with short logistic lines. In other words, very favorable military circumstances, and yet, this war is more than 2 years in, and it's still going on. They've struggled. To imagine that they could take on the NATO alliance that would bring the United States military in is really far-fetched. That said, is there a danger of escalation that neither side wants? In other words, stumbling into a confrontation rather than a premeditated Russian act of aggression? Yes, I think that is a very realistic threat, one that we're getting closer and closer to, and one that I think the Biden administration does not have a good strategy for managing.
Do you think that there's reason to be fearful in the U.S. after the recent meeting between Vladimir Putin and the heads of North Korea and Kim Jong-un? Do you think there is fear? We should be fearful of that. What does that say to you on an international front?
Well, it says that the Russians believe they're in a long-term confrontation with the United States, a competition that is not restricted to Ukraine, that this is about the United States trying to defeat Russia, to eliminate it as a great power, and in so doing, produce Russia's breakup and demise. So they think the stakes for them are existential, and they're attempting to make moves on the global chessboard that will help them cope with this enormous challenge that they think they're facing. Part of that is to shore up their relationship with North Korea. They're doing similar things to improve relations with Iran, with China. In other words, their approach is, in an existential conflict with the United States, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so this should be concerning for Americans.
What impact will this conflict have on the U.S. election?
Well, a little hard to say, but I think there's a general sense among American voters that America's position in the world is not strong, and that we're facing two active crises, one in the Ukraine, the other in the Middle East, and a potential third one with China. And it doesn't look like we have much of a clue how to handle this. So against that backdrop, I think a lot of voters are going to wonder, why should we be confident that Biden is going to do any better in the next 4 years than he has in his first term? And they may be willing to take more of a chance on somebody like Donald Trump that says America's approach to the world has been failing.
George, I appreciate the expertise as always. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be back here on Before You Vote. Please stick around. Welcome back to Before You Vote. Thank you to Senate President Warren Petersen, David Byler with Noble Predictive Insights, and George Beebe with the Quincy Institute for joining us today. Thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next Sunday right here on Before You Vote.